Welcome everyone to the Spring Institute 2022 with our first lecture on diversity with Dr. Joyce Miller from Texas A&M Commerce. Joyce is going to talk about diversity from a broad perspective, but specifically about critical race theory and the 1619 project. So we're welcoming those of you who have just joined us, and this will be recorded and it will be posted on the Great Plains Center for Gifted Studies YouTube channel afterwards. But Joyce, we'll turn it over to you. And for those of you who are joining us, she will welcome questions, and we will have a time at the end for questions. So welcome, Joyce.
Well, thank you very much, Connie, and welcome to our international audience of educators. Yes, this morning we are going to be talking about diversity, and within and in particular, looking at some words that we probably all heard about, even internationally. We will stop periodically, Martina, and ask questions to see if what the audience knows about critical race theory and the 1619 project. But, you know, diversity is a wonderful thing. Diversity comes in all shapes and sizes. Diversity involves, of course, developing an understanding and respect for all kinds of differences. But sometimes we have difficulties in including all the many different areas of differences, the history, the literature of a different people, the cultural values and different ways of thinking and being. Sometimes those diversities cause us problems. And it is seemingly a difficult concept to understand that there can be unity within diversity, that diversity and unity can coexist at the same time. So once we get our heads around that concept, I think we may be okay. But this morning we're looking at critical race theory and the 1619 project. So if you can, audience, in the chat box, if you could just type in anything that you know about critical race theory and the 1619 project, any words that come to mind, anything at all, just put it in the chat box, and we're going to let Martina and Connie read what's there. I'll give you just a few minutes to do that. Martina and Connie, do you see anything there yet?
Well, Joyce, I'm not sure about Italian. I'm checking the chat. There are a couple comments. I'll let Martina do the one. Let's see. I know maybe I chatted mine in someplace else. I don't see mine here, but and Martina, you'll have to tell us if there's something in Italian. And I will put the captions on. Rewriting history. It's looking at history from a perspective that benefits particular people.
Okay, all right. That's one perspective way of looking at critical race theory. Anyone else? Martina, is there anything in Italian?
No, nothing.
Okay.
But se volete dire, esprimere quello che volete su questa teoria sulla razza, ecco, we don't use the word race too much, so maybe
yeah. All right, okay. Well, here in America, we're celebrating here in the month of February what we call Black History Month. And we celebrate Black History Month because It's the history of a group of people who were enslaved in this country for 300 to 400 years. It's a group of people who have not lost their history, but don't really know their very own history. And so the 1 month out of each year is set aside as a way of focusing on the contributions of Black people to this country and to the world, who we are as a people. So critical race theory in America, and I don't know what impact it's had internationally, but I know here in America, it's the buzzword of the day. There's lots of talk about critical race theory, CRT, not to be confused with cultural responsive teaching, which we in our teacher education courses have incorporated. Martina, do I need to stop periodically so you can translate or anything? Do we need to do that?
I use the chat, Joyce, to translate something in Italian,
Okay,
so you can go on. Thank you very much.
okay. And the 1619 project is another uh, topic that's on the agenda here in America. And so we are faced as educators with trying to understand, first of all, what these two things are. And then number two, what does it mean for us as educators in our schools? All right. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, look at that photo. It says education, not indoctrination. Stop critical race theory now. And that's a group of people who are protesting there. Education, not indoctrination. Now, someone who is a supporter of critical race theory probably would look at that and say, not consider um, teaching Black history, teaching concepts related to race as indoctrination. So you have at least two sides of this issue. In the lower left-hand corner, there's a sign that says, I am not an oppressor. And that sign is being held up by a little girl, looks to be maybe about a first grader or a second grader. I am not an oppressor. And then the other lady is holding a sign that says, children should not be um, looked at for
Learn.
who they are, not what they look like. That children should learn to see people for who they are, not for what they look like. Well, if you are a person of color, um, you wake up every morning the color that you are, and you walk out into a world that often treats you differently because of your color. So you're constantly reminded of your color. And so it is to your advantage for people to look at your color and perceive it in a positive way as opposed to a negative way. So just a little bit different in ideology and ways of looking at the issues. So this morning we're going to take a look at these two concepts, some additional photos here. Look at this photo that's right in the center of these two. On the right and left sides, you have photos of individuals who are against critical race theory. It's the sign on the right, she had, excuse me, she has in her sign not only CTR, but she has intersectionality, a no on intersectionality, a no on social and emotional learning, a no on, looks like it's action civics. She's included a lot of things under her umbrella of not indoctrination. But in the very center here is a photo of some African American college students who are at a museum. and it's a African American museum that these young people had an opportunity to visit, and I believe it's in either Mississippi or Alabama. Uh, I went on this tour a couple of years ago, but it's a whole museum set aside to the life and culture of African American people. Uh, these young people, along with countless others, are hungry to learn about their own cultures. So the question for us today is, how do we address both of these issues in this kind of context? You got a group of people represented by the photo in the very center here who are hungry to learn about themselves and who would like to learn about themselves by means of the public school curriculum. But you have other people represented by those to the right and the photos to the right and left who are in opposition of anything addressing the culture of these people, seemingly. Further signs, it's been all over America, red and yellow, black and white. We are all precious in God's sight. Stop. No critical race theory. Stop division. So once again, we have a group of people in all sincerity expressing a point of view that few could disagree with. Red and yellow, black and white, we're all precious in God's sight. Most people would agree with that. That's a wonderful statement. But then she goes on to say, stop. No critical race theory. Stop division. So once again, she sees something that many are calling critical race theory. They're viewing it and labeling it as a negative. And under critical race theory, there are all those things that people like me, Black people, would consider positive. It's our culture, it's our history, the history of a group of people who were brought here, forced brought to the shores of America, and who for 300 to 400 years were enslaved, and who did not have opportunities to study, to learn, to educate themselves, to have businesses, to be individual people, but now are wanting to learn and know about themselves and feel that as others come to know about our culture, relations between groups of people who are different will be improved. So let's talk about the 1619 Project. The 1619 Project was initiated by a young lady named Nicole Sherry Hannah Jones. This young lady grew up in Waterloo, Iowa. And in the United States, Waterloo, Iowa is a very small little town. She was born in 1976 in this town. She grew up as a very smart, very intelligent young lady. She tells the story of how when she always loved to read. And in particular, she loved history. And her teachers in school knew that she loved history. And so she would ask her teachers whenever they taught some content, she would ask them for additional readings about that content. And so she did so to one of her history teachers. And one day her history teacher gave her a book by a famous Black historian who had written a book, and he talked about the 1619 date in his book. And Nicole Hannah Jones, was very intrigued by this book. Lerone Bennett was the African American historian who wrote this book. And so she remembered years later when after she graduated from college and gone on to seek employment at the New York Times, she remembered this date, the 1619, and how in Lerone Bennett's book, he talked about that was the first date when slaves were brought to the shores of America, and that there were about 20 to 30 slaves who came in 1619 to the shores of America. Well, I remember when I used to teach the history of education, I would always begin with 1620. That was one of my first slides. In fact, it was the first slide in my slide deck, 1620. And I would go on to talk about how 1620 is when the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, and how they brought with them all of their ideas from Europe as to how education should be set up, how schools should be organized, how businesses should be organized, how the health system should be organized. They brought with them all of their ideas in 1620 to the shores of America, and that was the beginning of our country, the United States of America. And many historians, too, began with that date, 1620. It's in all of our history books. But then this young lady does a project, and she began it shortly before the 400th celebration of 1619. She began this project in 2019 as doing research in celebration of the 400th year of the landing of those slaves to the shores of America. And so she began this project, and many others who were employed at the New York Times also joined her in researching and uncovering all this information that they have published in a book called the 1619 Project. And I'll share with you this book when we stop showing our slides here. But she published this book in 2019. She, this was all after her graduating from high school in little Waterloo, Iowa, going off to college to the University of Notre Dame, going and getting her master's degree from the University of North Carolina, and then finally landing this job at the New York Times. And then she was given this assignment to cover the civil rights movement and anything related to civil rights. But then they also gave her the project to work on the 1619 project, because the 400th anniversary of that project was coming up in 2019. And so she began that, and as a result of her work, she won the Pulitzer Prize for her writing. This young lady, as I said before, was very gifted because she had already been recognized even before she became a part of the New York Times, and even long before she earned the Pulitzer Prize. She had been earning all kinds of awards for her journalism. Her journalism days began in high school. They continued on to college, and on to when she began employment at the New York Times. So look at this statement here, because this is the crux of the controversy surrounding the project, 1619 project. In August 1619, and this is a direct quote, just 12 years after the English settled Jamestown, Virginia, 1 year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, and some 156 years before English colonists here decided they wanted to form their own country, the Jamestown colonists bought 20 to 30 enslaved Africans from English pirates. They were among the more than 12.5 million Africans who would be kidnapped from their homes and brought in chains across the Atlantic Ocean in the largest forced migration in human history until the Second World War. So that's an excerpt from Nicole's book. So here's the crux of the controversy. Here's some representative statements. There are those who say, and we're talking about historians in this country who made a name for themselves by writing history that begins the history of America with 1620. They are, some of them, up in arms. There are some who've been very supportive of Nicole's research and her work with the New York Times. Look at this. Some say that it reframes the country's history, starting the history of the United States of America in a very negative way, starting it with slavery. And who wants to hear that? You know, it's a negative way to begin the story of our country. It seeks to place enslavement at the center of the American story. And who wants to hear that? The project suggests that the nation, the country of America, was founded in 1619 rather than 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. No, and then this last statement here, one of the primary reasons, and this is a quote, the colonists, and this is from the book, one of the primary reasons the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. But there have been many who've been up in arms about this. And this is the only quote from the book that the New York Times has modified it. And they modified it to say, one of the primary reasons of some of the colonists decided to declare their independence, that some of the colonists wanted to protect the institution of slavery, and that's why they started the war in seeking their independence from Britain. And so they modified that statement, but everything else that they decided to let stand as is. The New York Times has decided they're going to stand behind what has been published. But here is the controversy. And when we started out doing this presentation, Connie said that it's a rewriting of the history that to a point of view with which many are not in support of. So that's part of the controversy. So, but consider the impact of policies and practices that have been put into place over many, many years. First of all, we said that we had 12.5 million enslaved people brought to the shores of America. You really think about it. What human being has the right to enslave another human being? And to do that for not just a short period of time, we're talking about 300 years, 300 to 400 years to enslave a group of people. And in addition to that, consider the impact of that enslavement that has occurred over the years. Today, well, in some cases, we still have racially segregated schools. We still have schools that are underfunded. We still have disproportionate discipline of Black students, barriers to gifted programs for Black students in our schools, barriers to selective admission of Black students, curriculum that reinforces racist ideas. We have inequities in the areas of health, voting rights, economic issues, criminal justice issues, incarceration, school to prison pipeline issues. We have environmental justice issues, all impacting the same group of people who were brought to the shores of America enslaved, in chains. Now, fast forward to a young lady named Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw created the critical race theory. She is a graduate of Cornell University. She grew up in Canton, Ohio. She has a law degree from Harvard, and she has too earned all kinds of awards and recognitions. And she is the founder of the critical race theory. The critical race theory places an emphasis on social justice. In the field of education, we talk about it as a commitment to social justice. We talk about it as a way of centering experiential knowledge, the experiences of people of color. We talk about it as multiple approaches of looking at race from multiple approaches. We also talk about critical race theory as it impacts women's study, sociology, history, law, and many, many other fields. Critical race theory really has a home in law school. They teach it. In fact, they have classes entitled Critical Race Theory. And the lawyers study how the law constructs race. They raise questions like, how has the law protected racism and upheld racial hierarchy? How does the law reproduce racial inequality? How can the law be used to dismantle racism, and racial inequality? So critical race theory is a very real kind of issue in law school. It's also a real issue in education. When our doctoral students want to do dissertations addressing the African American culture, we often ask them to go back and look at critical race theory. And when they write the theoretical underpinnings for their study, they go into some of the issues that impact the historical issues that serve as justification for them wanting to undertake the study that they're taking, addressing African American culture. So critical race theory is a way of understanding how American racism has shaped public policy. And yes, it does give centrality to something that a lot of people consider negative, and that's the word race and racism. Well, if you go back to the founding of this country, we see that racism is just an inherent part of our country. As I said before, the slaves were brought unwillingly to the shores of America, and so therein was a sin. Some call it the original sin, and it has caused the racism and race to be just an inherent part of much of what we do in our country. So it's an academic concept. We've been talking about it for over 40 years. The core idea is that race is a social construct and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but something that is embedded in the legal system and in policies. Now, when you take a look at systemic racism, we find that it pervades almost every system you can think about here in America. Also here in America, Martina and my Italian colleagues, we spend an awful lot of time talking about race in this country. It seems to be so pervasive. You can take just a normal issue, but the minute any elements of race become involved, all of a sudden it is an explosive issue for us here in this country. So there is something to be said. We can make a case for systemic racism, and we can make a case for the fact that race and racism are inherently a part of what this country is about. So it pervades all of these different areas that you see here. Every area of study is touched by some aspect of race and racism. So today, politicians have started to use critical race theory as a catch-all phrase. It's being used by the politicians to rally voters, to rally people around this negative issue. Few of laymen and even some educators, few really understand what critical race theory is. And so it's being used as kind of a boogie bear, a scare tactic. All people have to do is just say the words racism, critical race theory, and it conjures up fear. So what is it that we mean by critical race theory? This is a photo here from history. This is a real young lady who was seeking to desegregate schools in the South. These are real housewives here who during the time followed this young lady. And it looks like, just to look at their faces, that they're saying some pretty awful things to this young lady. They don't look very kind. They don't look very welcoming. But that's a part of our history. What are we to do? Do we not talk about these historical events? Do we set them aside? Do we hide this? The photographers of the day recorded history as it was occurring. So, do we cover it up? What do we do? Now, this particular image, and I just Googled this, it appears millions of times on our internet. So how are we? We talk about critical race theory. We don't want to talk about this. Let's set it aside. Let's not make our children, our white children in our classes, feel guilty for something with which they had nothing to do with. But at the same time, we don't think about the impact that even this picture here has on little Black kids that are sitting in the very same classes. So think about it from the perspective of both the little white kids and how they feel by looking at this photo, and how do Black kids feel as they look at this photo. But it is history. It is not an untruth. What does it mean? What does critical race theory mean? Does it mean that we don't tell the story, the Ruby Bridges story? Every third grader has read the Ruby Bridges story. It's a part of a lot of third grade curricula. And look at the number of images that are on our internet. It's pervasive. It's all out there. It's a part of our history. A little book like Going Someplace Special that talks about a little girl who grew up in the South when there was a lot of de facto segregation, and that is a real term, not made up. It's from our history. It is from a time when Black people, those very same people who were enslaved and brought in chains to the shores of America, could not check into a hotel, who could not drink out of certain water fountains, who could not use certain restroom facilities, who could not go to certain restaurants during a certain time. So de facto, and it was in fact the law, in other words, they could not go. And if they were to try to drink out of those water fountains or sit on a particular park bench or go or check into a particular hotel or sit in a certain place on a bus, they could literally be put into jail. So, but that's a part of our history. It's ugly, but it's true. Are we not to talk about Rosa Parks? Well, there was a time when Black people by law had to sit at a certain place on the bus and could not sit in the front of the bus. The story is that Rosa, who was a seamstress, got on the bus after a long day of work, sat down, and the first seat that she saw, which was in a section which by law she was not supposed to sit. But she was tired on that day, and she decided to stand up by sitting down. And as a result of Rosa's, was well known in this town. Everybody knew Miss Parks. She was a very quiet lady who went about her business, but a very strong-willed lady. She was a member of the NAACP. She was the secretary of the NAACP. And so when the word went all over her little town that Miss Rosa had been arrested, people were up in arms. So much so that the next day, all the Black people in this town decided that they were not going to ride the bus either, that they were going to walk. And they did so until changes were made. And so today, Racism is in film, the film industry. The film industry is making movies and podcasts and Instagram and TikTok, about racial issues. How do we get away from it? It's a reality. It's not a negative in the United States of America. It's very much a part of who we are. Black Lives Matter is a very real issue. Of course, the lives of all people matter. But when we look back historically and we look at how lives have been taken, Black lives have been taken, Black people have been killed for no reason at all over the years, been cited case after case after case after case. And so it makes you want to conclude that maybe some people think Black lives do not matter. You can't make that kind of case when you think about other racial groups. But definitely all lives matter. But we have to say loud and clear that Black lives matter because the history seems to say Black lives don't matter. Racism, end racism. All of us want to do that. How do we get there is the question. Some states have already put laws into place. In the state of Texas, by September 1, 2022, critical race theory has been banned from schools. And so beginning this summer on into the fall, every legislative session in Texas will be obsessed with discussing critical race theory. There will be lots of committee meetings and lots of discussions about critical race theory. What does it mean? What history do you want to leave out? And why do you not want that particular history included? And so lots of discussions are going to be going on all over these United States. Critical race theory, 1619. Hopefully our discussion has just provided a little bit of illumination concerning what we're talking about and what this issue is all about. I know teachers in America are still asking. They just want to know, what am I to teach? And how am I to teach? Just tell me. They don't want to lose their jobs. They want to know. And so we'll be endeavoring here in America to try to answer those questions for our teachers and for the good of our nation. Thank you very much. Well, I'll now take any questions that you may have.
Well, Joyce, I'd like to say thank you so much for all of this wonderful information, not only during Black History Month in the United States, but also looking back through our history. And I know you were very kind in the way you spoke about the history of the Black people in the United States, because a lot of it is quite terrifying, actually, murderous and terrifying. So we're glad to celebrate that this month, and glad of organizations like Black Lives Matters and this lecture in particular. I know that this is difficult for international people to understand because they don't look at skin color the way Americans do. A lot of countries don't. So I'd encourage, I do know, however, that people in Italy have a different perspective of certain types of people in their own country. So it might be similar in that way, where some people are perhaps looked down on for different reasons. But in the United States, it was far, far different, because the people, the Black people who came to the United States as slaves had no rights at all. They weren't even necessarily thought to be human. So let's see if there's some questions here, because we've got a great resource with Dr. Miller to address those.
Thank you very much, Joyce, for your lecture. Se avete domande, se volete condividere qualche pensiero, come diceva anche la professoressa Conny, la nostra prospettiva, no, italiana verso questa tematica, come vediamo noi. Sì, vedo una mano alzata. Ok, yes.
Yes, can you hear me? No, I don't have any questions.
We can't hear you. Sorry, we can't hear you. Maybe it's my problem.
Now, is it better now? Can you hear me now? Okay, yes. No, I was saying that I don't have questions, but I simply wanted to thank you for this lecture because, as you said, in Italy at least, we don't have this approach, so we don't have this the same feeling about racism, and so also the lecture that you gave about the rewriting of the history. It was very interesting. So I just want to thank you. I'm sorry, unfortunately, my microphone is not working very well. Sorry. But I just wanted to thank you for this interesting lecture. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you for those comments. You know, another way of thinking about the experiences that the Black people have faced in the United States might be to think of another racial group, the Jewish people, and what they experienced during World War II. I'm pretty sure Europeans have a pretty good idea what that was all about, because there were death camps all over Europe, Dachau, Auschwitz, and I think probably at least one in Italy. I know in France, there was Drancy, and the Jews from Hungary, Poland, Germany, all through Europe were so disliked that they were organized and taken to death camps and eliminated in those ways. So that's a particular period of time, maybe a 10-year period of time or so, whereas in the United States, Joyce gave a date that goes back a few centuries. So it's hard to compare something horrific like the Holocaust to the Black people, but it is similar in the sense that there are people who are disliked or who are treated differently, and as in the case of the Holocaust, killed, you know, but not so different always in the United States either, because there were groups, and Joyce didn't mention them, but we had a group earlier in the 19th century that continues through, it still does exist, called the Ku Klux Klan. And they would hang people and burn them on crosses. We're talking about Black people, okay? If a Black male even, you know, looked at a white woman or approached a white woman, there was such hostility that that person would very likely could be in danger of their life. And there were many lynchings and effigies. I don't know if you know the word effigy. I'll try to type it here in the chat for you. Joyce can maybe, I think I typed it correctly. Effigies were like a scare, something to scare people. So sometimes even if people weren't hanged themselves or crucified and burned on a cross, they would make an image of someone and they would hang or burn even that person. So that was also, you know, a hate crime. Joyce, do you have anything else to say? You know, what we've heard from Leo, it says Leo, I'm not sure That's your name. But
No,
would
I'm
anybody
not
else like to comment?
To underscore what Connie said about lynchings in America, I mean, we even have museums in America that are devoted to lynchings. There were so many of them that occurred. We have history museums on lynching in different parts of America. So lynching, the hanging of African American people from large trees was just a way of terrorizing and controlling Black people in the 19th and 20th century. And so, a lot of research and writings have been done on lynchings. There were just so many of them. It's a whole history of lynchings in the South and lynchings mainly in the South. And you've heard of that expression, strange fruit. Southern trees bear a strange fruit. Blood on the leaves and blood at the root, Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. So no, it's not pretty, but it's history. And the question is, do we cover it up? Do we hide it? What do we do with it? It really happened. It's history. So it's a dilemma that we're going to be facing and talking about here in America. And hopefully this discussion will will result in improving relations among Black people and others here in our United States of America. I know silence is not the answer. We've got to gather around the table. We've got to begin the dialogue and talk. We've got to begin to come to some understandings about where we are as a nation and realize that you don't move forward by covering up truth. You only move forward by revealing and coming to some understandings about what it is and coming to some realization that it is what it is.
Well, Joyce, I've known you for a long time, as you know, and I just am so grateful for the leadership that you show in this area. I can say that I remember growing up as a child with I lived in a couple different cities, a larger city and a smaller city for a while when I was growing up. And I can remember I would have probably been about 10 years old. And someone said to me, do not put your hand in that place, because a Black person only, I think it would have been called Negro at the time. It wasn't a really
Yeah.
offensive word, but at that time we used the word, the polite term was called Negro, whereas the polite term now, or the accepted term, is Black. And we didn't use the N word with it, but it was, don't put your hand there, because a Negro was just there. So, just like the Jews were thought, the Jews were really thought to be um, like diseased people, almost worse than human, in some ways. And that was sort of, you don't want to be near those people. So I didn't hear it frequently, but I'm I don't know, young enough, old enough to remember that. And it's pretty sad. And even in my growing up years, desegregation occurred. And I can say that there are still problems, and there's a lot of hostility even in 2022. I don't think that there's any question about that. So it's the United States is a wonderful place, but just like Europe has its shame with the Holocaust, we have our shame, and not just with the Black people. We have committed some pretty serious crimes against the Native Americans as well. And I'm just so happy, Joyce, that we have this opportunity to celebrate Black History Month and to remember the importance of respect, diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. So any other questions? If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to remind you that we have our second Renzulli lecture with Tony Kabushek on Tuesday. It would be 12 o'clock US time, which is Central Time. And I don't know why I can't seem to get this right, but it would be 7 hours later. I still think that 7 plus 12 is 19. So yeah, so we hope you'll join us then. And again, this lecture will be posted on YouTube. So if you have questions in the meantime, contact Martina in Italy, Joyce in Texas, or Connie in Kansas. So I'm going to sign off and say, have a great evening. Have a wonderful dinner tonight, and a wonderful afternoon here in the United States. It's nice and sunny. So I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Thank you for joining.
Ciao, ciao. Enjoyed it.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.